Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in The Stream. Today, what's it like to go undercover in the world of white supremacy? We hear the extraordinary stories of people who've posed as racists in an attempt to expose them. Hate is on the rise. In 2017, for the second year in a row, the number of hate groups in the US rose. And since 1999, the total number of hate groups there has more than doubled. That's according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. But anti-racism activists say it's not just the US where they're seeing evidence of a growing movement across the Western world. So, how are they tackling it? For some, the answer is infiltration, going undercover as white supremacists. Joining us now, we have Patrik Hermansson. He is a researcher for Hope Not Hate. That's an anti-racism group. Joe Mulhall is a senior researcher for Hope Not Hate. Theo Wilson is a community organiser. And Mike German is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and a former FBI undercover agent. Gentlemen, it's good to see you here. You all have various different stories of how you infiltrated the far right. Let me start with a documentary called My Year in Kekistan, Undercover in the Far Right. Have a look.
For the past year, I've infiltrated the alt-right in the UK and America. This is my story.
Real white power hour!
You are commanded to immediately disperse.
They were asked to disperse. They've retracted the permit. Some are leaving, but far from all of them. Some are taking on gas masks instead.
Joe, Hope Not Hate have done undercover work before. Fatima Abdullah asks here, what made you go undercover? What's the premise? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, what's really central to what we're trying to do with undercover work is find out the bits that we can't find out from surface level research. I mean, you can find out so much from looking at what they publish and what they say, but quite often when we look at extreme far-right organisations, there's a clear difference between what they say publicly in terms of what their front of house images that they portray to the world and what they say privately and how they organise. So that's the first bit. And then the second bit is new movements like the so-called alt-right. We have to try and find out how they organise. We have to try and be one step ahead. We have to see how they operate and organise internally. And that allows us as an anti-racist organisation to come up with ways to tackle it. And you can't tackle what you don't understand, so it's central to that understanding.
I'm just thinking about preparation, because basically what we're talking about here is posing as a racist. Patrik, how did you get your mindset in that space where you could spend a year being racist?
Well, it's quite surprising of how little you have to say in racist things. You just have to agree, nod along. And I focused most of what I said, and I built my identity around criticism of the left and freedom of speech and that sort of thing. So the amount of racist things I've said over the last year, close to none.
Ah, interesting. Mike was nodding as you were saying, you just have to nod along. Mike, let me show everybody what you looked like when you were going undercover looking at militias on the Pacific Northwest. This is you back here. That idea of preparing yourself to go undercover, what did you have to do?
Well, I mean, it took a lot of work because, of course, we weren't just trying to get into the ideological side of the movement, the organization. Rather, we were focusing on gathering evidence of criminal acts. So there's a sort of fringe element within these groups that are involved in manufacturing illegal weapons, manufacturing explosives, things like that. So it was a very specific subset of the group that we were trying to get into. So it required a lot of investigative preparation, finding out who was actually involved in criminal activities so that we could focus the operation around what they needed help with, basically.
Sure. Lucius 25, Theo, who is he? Tell us about him.
Lucius 25 is just a character I created online as I was getting trolled. I wanted to see if I could create the echo chamber effect in my favor. So a new online account was necessary with a brand new digital footprint so I could hopefully get to the root of the propaganda wing and what was spreading this movement so fast online. And that's why I created the account.
So we're setting the scene here. 2015, there was a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement was out there. There was a lot of calling and protesting for racial justice. And you were doing what online that was making you be trolled so much?
I was just posting my own videos. I am a police brutality survivor. I have also lost a friend at the hands of police. And so in my own content, I was attracting, should we say, the dark side of the internet. And I would trace some of these guys, and I figured out, oh, these are some shell accounts. And so just this idea dawned on me, said, two can play that game. And so I decided to just see what happened. And yeah, it was born from that. And when I was doing it, I didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't even find it all that courageous. Turns out it was ideologically courageous because I was challenging myself. But I didn't think it would turn to all this that it has become. So yeah, I'm honored to be in the company that I'm in right now.
So all this that it had become was you talking about your experience in a TEDx talk.
Yeah.
Have a look. Here's a little clip.
Yeah.
And to think, like years ago, I would have needed like acting training and like makeup and a fake ID. Now I could just lurk. And so I started with a little info wars, went on into some American Renaissance, National Vanguard Alliance. And, you know, I started commenting on videos, talking bad about Al Sharpton and Black Lives Matter. I started bemoaning race baiters like Eric Holder and Barack Obama. And just mirroring the anti-Black sentiments that were thrown at me. And to be honest, it was kind of exhilarating.
So Theo, as Lucius, 25,
Yes.
you are mimicking what? What does that person look like that you're mimicking? What are you saying? What are you doing?
What I tried to do was throw some of the more intellectual arguments about anti-Blackness at these folks to see what else I could glean. It was easier to be a hyperbolic troll and say outlandish things, but I wanted to see if there was a strong ideological basis.
Like
and
what?
I found was that, well, it seems to me that the alt-right used a white victim narrative to bait a brand new generation of guys who didn't really get the full historical knowledge of what race actually meant in this culture, using the blowback from centuries of racism and framing that blowback as oppression. They were able to say, well, you guys are also victims. Here is a way out of that victimhood. And so a lot of guys without the knowledge fell for a lot of rebranded Mein Kampf ideas, and it was interesting to see it spin out.
Let me put this to you, Joe. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, it's really, really interesting what you're saying, because it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the key elements of the alt-right is they cast themselves as a white identity movement, and it's central to them is a notion of victimhood. I mean, and this is across lots of white supremacist and far-right movements in Western Europe and North America. This notion that seems paradoxical to most people, but they genuinely believe that the most persecuted people are white, straight Christian men. And the way they see it is that, well, as they would argue, kind of left-wing cultural hegemony, this notion that, you know, equality, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, and political correctness is oppressing them. And they see the kind of leveling out of societies as them being persecuted. So he's absolutely right in what he's saying there. It's a fundamental element of these far-right movements is this notion of feeling oppressed.
And I think that goes way back, right? I mean, the interesting thing, I think the most surprising thing to me when I first went into the neo-Nazi movement was how old these ideas are. And you have to remember, you know, it was only 150 years ago that we were fighting to outlaw slavery in this country. It was only 60, 70 years ago that the far right had control in Europe. So, you know, these ideas were around for a long time, and the way it was framed, that just in a way that justified slavery and colonialism, was the concept of the white man's burden, right? It was this infringement on white people that there were these other people out there that we had to go and police and take care of and administrate over them and that kind of thing. So these ideas have a long heritage going back hundreds of years.
Terry McKinney says this on Twitter: what's hard to understand about master race philosophy? We saw it in Nazi Germany, Israel, South Africa, America. It's hardly misunderstood. Basically, what's the point of going undercover? Theo?
Well, I think what was interesting was it sprang up after it looked like we made a lot of progress. I was doing this during the Obama era, and the idea of integration was if we get close to these folks, we meaning black people, and you see that we're just as human as you, then a lot of this lynch mob culture is going to be stopped. And I said in the Washington Post, you never joined your dad on a lynch mob, never smelled the body of somebody burning like you did in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So how could this spring up again? It wasn't about the idea in and of itself, it's how did it return? And I think that if we understand it from that perspective, it gets clear why we did what we did.
Patrik, how dangerous was what you did for a whole year, pretending to be somebody that you weren't, pretending to be a racist?
It's in many of these groups that I've been in are not directly dangerous to me. Their ideology and ideas are dangerous to people, but as you see, I'm a white guy. I'm not their primary target. Some of them, though, primarily in the US, they are armed and they talk about what they want to do with anti-fascists, with gay people as well. And in those situations, I felt threatened, of course.
Joe, to your point, there's a level of revelation that comes from your work, definitely going undercover, and then Patrik shooting it. There's a little clip with a gentleman called Greg Johnson. Tell us who he is. He's talking about what to do about the Jewish problem, which sends tingles down my spine when I even hear that language. But tell us about Greg, first of all.
Yeah, Greg Johnson is a kind of prominent, now would be classed as alt-right figure, but he's a long-standing member of the American far right, a very prominent member of the American far right. He's been around for a very, very long time. One of the things actually in terms of Hope Not Hate's infiltration that Patrik captured was the first ever footage and first ever pictures of Greg Johnson. And that's another example of why this sort of work can be really, really useful. We live in an age where, because of the internet, far-right activism has a lower social cost in some senses than it did previously. Activists can sit in their bedroom in one place in the world and either engage in hate crimes online to people in other parts of the world. They can engage in far-right activism. So by infiltrating, etc., we find out who these people are, we find out what they're planning. But things like Greg Johnson, when Patrik managed to get his picture, it increases the social cost of activism. It means that people start to realize that they might not be able to do this anonymously. And if they decide to make that move into, engaging in active hatred online, then we will find them.
Sure. Let's have a little look at what Patrik shot undercover. This is Greg Johnson.
What would be your suggested solution to the Jewish question or Jewish problem, if one defines it as the unsatisfactoriness of a very small population exerting a lot of influence over the majority population, whether there's disparity there? I mean, what would be your solution to that problem?
Well, the solution ultimately is to expel them.
To Israel?
Yeah.
See, Theo, when Joe was mentioning about people sitting in their bedrooms, talking about alt-right philosophy, so there was some agreement there. You noticed that, you recognise that?
Well, yeah, it's I suppose what they call something like the cage effect. When you're driving, for example, certain negative aspects of your personality get amplified because you're divorced from the consequences in a very real way. You're surrounded by a cage. Well, I believe that's even taken to a higher level on the internet. And so the anonymity makes it so that you don't have to face the consequences. If you say this to a guy, you know what I'm saying, specifically like a guy of my size in my face, there's going to be a level of danger that's associated with it. And a lot of times, face-to-face, they change their tune. So, yeah, it is the cowardice, and I'm just going to call it what it is, of not being able to back up these convictions face-to-face, and now you get to hide behind the internet.
Theo, but let me put this to you. This is from Braylon Carr, again on Twitter. You learn absolutely nothing from going undercover, but social media validation and acknowledgement. You're actually giving the alt-right some oxygen, some air to breathe and to flourish.
I would say this. What happened in Charlottesville when they came out into the open was that they committed an act of murder, right? And I knew that this was coming. I saw it as inevitable. I posted a video called A Warning to the Alt-Right, and I said, you're letting too many crazies into your organization, and pretty soon something is going to happen. When this manifested, they actually, due to this insane mindset that they had, that they could just act this way, did something to remove their moral high ground. and create a backlash against them socially that they're not going to recover from. And so I believe that even if it is giving them any bit of light, it's the kind of light that shines on something that's negative that we need to actually remove. And I think a lot of the country is seeing that right now.
Can I just quickly add to that point?
Go ahead, Joe.
I completely agree. I mean, I disagree with the question, actually, fundamentally. I mean, obviously, it depends. Certain far-right movements don't exist online whatsoever, and we have to find information where we can from being on the ground with those groups. But for certain far-right movements, online space is hugely important for them. They don't often have offline activists. The alt-right, as it's so-called now, is primarily an anonymous movement. It's primarily an online movement, and we have to be in those online spaces. And so the work that people like Theo have done getting into those spaces and listening to them is very important, because otherwise they can go into these spaces for long periods of time, unwatched, unlistening, and engage in all sorts of horrible things, and no one will ever see it. So I disagree, actually. I think it involves both requiring online and offline work.
This is Dino Con, and Dino Con Mike says, I've been involved with the alt-right for a long time and can tell you that no, our ideas are not well understood. That's somebody who's very comfortable saying, this is who I am, this is what I believe. Mike, go ahead.
I was just going to go back to the last question where I think there is some fair media criticism. I don't think it's necessarily applicable in Patrik or Theo's case. But, you know, one thing that I would recommend to any media organization, if you're doing overt interviews, you know, nobody makes these people the leader of a group. It's not like there's a democratic process and they vote them in. They just declare they are. But as soon as a mainstream media outlet puts a microphone in front of them, that makes them actually legitimate and draws followers to them. So you do have to be careful in how you cover these groups, and particularly when they're covered in a way that brings their ideas into the mainstream political discourse. You know, I would defend their right to have their free speech, but that doesn't mean we need to give them a platform.
We have Chili Bill here.
And I would add that that the work that Theo and Patrik did, I think, elevates that and actually is about challenging their ideas and the way that they organize rather than just sensationalizing because this is some famous Ku Klux Klansman or something.
Sure. We're live on YouTube right now. At Chili Billy says, do you think there's a way to improve our education system to tackle far-right ideologies? Should they be discussed rather than ignored? Joe?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things we have to do. I mean, we have to be better at teaching history. I mean, I'm not just biased because I'm a historian, but we have to teach the history of these movements. We have to teach the logical conclusions of these prejudices when enacted as politics. There's a long track record. There's a long history of what happens when we allow hateful ideas to go unchecked. It results in murder. It results in gas chambers. And we have to teach children. We have to educate children about the history of what these things do. There is also, I mean, yes, it's not about necessarily just shutting everything down. I mean, we have to challenge. Kids will come into schools, into classrooms with prejudices, and everyone has elements of prejudice within them. And we have to challenge those and we have to discuss those. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think just shouting racist or waving flags is going to be enough. In some sense, we will have to engage. People articulate fears and concerns in ways that we disagree with. And in those people, we need to engage with. I guess the key is engaging with normal people that might have views we disagree with and doing more robust research and attempting to combat organizations and activist individuals that are propagating these ideas more broadly.
Theo, there was a lot that we learned from your TEDx talk. I'm going to get people just to go look at it, go watch it. But Roxana Rahman here says, did you find any of the people that you engage with to be fine people, real fine people, nice people? Different beliefs?
You know, fine people and nice people are two different things.
Yeah.
I've engaged with people who are very kind. Yeah. That doesn't mean that their ideologies aren't destructive. And here's what I think is most salient about this. A huge robbery has taken place of the white children of not only America, but of the world. And that is that you've been handed this shining empire, and nobody really told you the details of how this empire was built. Nobody told you the true number of bodies that are lying beneath this empire. And that's like giving somebody a company and only telling them about the assets and not the liabilities. when the history is taught correctly, you understand that racism has a certain context and that it was fundamental to creating the social caste systems that make the current world as it is right now. And there was economic motives, there was political motives, and there was certainly cultural motives behind that. And then with that context, you have a barrier for when the wild landscape of the internet starts spewing these old new ideas about white supremacy, because you've already been inoculated against that by knowing the truth about how this thing was actually created. And if you don't do that, I'm sorry, but it's just going to perpetuate to the next generation.
Patrik, did you like any of the people that you spent a year with?
I agree with what you said. I mean, there are, of course, like, I met many of these people face to face many times. We had coffee, a beer, and so on. And there are these moments in that you feel sympathy for them. They have problems that I have. They have problems with paying rent and their families and so on. But you're always very aware of what you're doing. You're always very aware of their politics, ideological beliefs, and what they want to achieve, that they are nice to you because of my blue eyes. So that always puts a distance between me and them. And in the end, of course, I don't really feel that much sympathy for them. No.
Joe, I'm just wondering about the seriousness of what you discovered. Sometimes as I was watching and reading your report, I would see things like this. The notorious Hitler ceramist, Charles Kraft. This just is bizarre and ridiculous. And then there was another gentleman, another leader, thought leader, who would wear, not exactly lederhosen, but he'd be wearing little shorts, and it looked like he was in the Hitler Youth group, but he was incredibly serious and very high up in the alt-right movement. So how seriously should we be taking this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt that the individual you're referring to there is a British activist called Stead Stedman, who walks around in shorts all year round. And, there's no doubt there's a level of esotericness and strangeness to some of these individuals and some of these movements. But that doesn't belie their dangerousness, or, it doesn't cover that up. If we're looking at this movement that Patrik spent a year inside, yes, it's extremely dangerous. First of all, as I say, it's attracting young people in a way that some far-right movements, especially in Western Europe, have struggled to do for some time. It's anonymous. It's large numbers. Some of these websites have tens of thousands or 100,000s of visitors. They're raising money. Some people in Europe the other day raised 200 grand for a project they were running in Europe, so there's financing behind it. And as we saw in Charlottesville, ideas have consequences. And whether or not this man is wearing shorts or not, some of these individuals that engage in this form of activism, it's resulting in someone dying on the streets of Charlottesville. So yes, we have to take it incredibly seriously.
Mike, I'm just...
And I think...
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I think law enforcement needs to do a better job of understanding how these groups operate, and particularly the criminal element within these groups operate. And, as Theo said, I could watch this coming too. I mean, the amount of violence that was happening at these protests that was, for the most part, unpoliced, was increasing at every protest over the course of a year, culminating in Charlottesville. So if Theo sitting online could see this coming, and I doing the research could see it coming, why law enforcement wasn't better prepared for it, I think is a hard question to answer.
Well, can I interject something in there right there? Let's talk about law enforcement for a minute, because you brought up a good point, brother.
So Theo, I'm going to ask you to do it in a sentence, because I'm literally 30 seconds before the end of the show, but make it impactful. I know you can do it. Go ahead.
If the FBI's counterterrorism wing in 2008 released a memo that said, y'all better be looking out for infiltration from white nationalists into police forces, and it was ignored, I think we're looking at a systemic problem. That's all I'm going to say.
I agree.
Patrik and Joe and Theo and Mike, thank you so much for your insight into the value of going undercover in the alt-right movement. It's a movement that goes around the world. We really appreciate your intakes from different parts, your input from different parts of the world. But before we go, a reminder that we are now streaming every day live on YouTube, and you can speak to our producers directly, and you may find that your questions and your comments featured on the show. You'll see the link to the live show every day on the Al Jazeera English YouTube page. It's right there. Do you see it? Under upcoming live streams. And of course, you can always find us on Twitter using #AJStream. See you online. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.